Season 4 of Notebook on Cities and Culture is brought to you by Daniel Murphy, Polar Inertia, a journal of nomadic and popular culture online at polarinertia.com, and by Press Up, friendly web consultants who listen to your goals and provide solutions that make sense. Online at pressupinc.com. When you're at a dinner party, how do you know it's a Toronto dinner party? What's a defining characteristic of a Toronto dinner party?
Oh, this is a question for me. I thought this was the first person sort of asking to the ether.
No, I'm not even asking the ether. You're on the spot.
I've never been to a dinner party in another city, so I don't know what's different about it. But now I want to be invited to a dinner party in LA and New York and whatever. I can't name another city, but
right. Those are the cities there are. What do you suspect is Torontonian about the dinner parties you've been to?
Well, I mean, Torontonians, I think, have a reputation for being uptight. Despite what we want to project about our image around the world, countered with our embarrassment about our mayor, the reality is we're not so far off from being a pretty Protestant town where I'm 39. When I was a kid, businesses were closed on Sundays. You couldn't buy liquor on Sundays. Not that as a child I was looking to score booze on Sundays. But as multicultural as we are, we're still pretty white. And we still, I think, have earned that reputation for being not as fun. You know, in Canada, you mentioned Vancouver, and Vancouver's newer, and Vancouver is sort of more outdoorsy. And Montreal is more fun. I mean, that's the classic distinction between us, right? Is that you go to Montreal, more kisses on the cheeks, more red wine, more just everyone's in a better mood. People are, not that they're smarter, better looking, but they're more ready to have a good time. And that's probably reflected in the hours that you can serve alcohol.
Sure. It's reflected. It's both cause and effect of that. I hear a lot of complaints in Vancouver about the hours that they can serve alcohol or play live music. I mean, Vancouver's got the distinction no fun city. I think Vancouverites think of Toronto as more fun. And by the way, Toronto, comparatively fun city, is where I'm sitting today on Notebook on Cities and Culture, talking today with Corey Mintz here in Kensington Market. He knows a lot about food, and this neighborhood seems to be a lot about food. He writes the column Fed for the Toronto Star. He's the author of the book How to Host a Dinner Party as well. So when did you realize you had dinner party expertise, even if not identifying Toronto dinner party expertise?
I was having a dinner party. This was about 6 or 7 years ago, and at the time I was bottoming out of my cooking career. I'd been to cooking school, and I'd spent a number of years cooking, and I'd cooked in a couple good restaurants. Really, one good restaurant. Let's be honest with ourselves, where I learned everything. But I was, in acting at this point, I would have been doing porn. You know what I mean? I was cooking in a dinner theater.
Oh my!
Which is so that's
what are they serving at that dinner theater?
Stuffed chicken breasts.
Oh boy!
So a lot of stuffed chicken breasts, but I mean, hundreds at a time, right? Versus I had cooked in a restaurant where you were juggling 6 or 8 things at a time, and each plate had eight little, a little crispy garnish and a little salad of this, and I'm juggling a pan, sautéing sweetbreads. Well. I'm getting stretched just thinking. Either way, I was not made for that career, right? I mean, I looked around the room and I could see people were better at it than me. And at the end, I realized I wanted to write. I started writing, but didn't know what I wanted to write. And I just started contributing for a blog that wanted me to write for free. And I started getting a gig for an alt weekly writing restaurant reviews. And I realized that it was the end for this cooking gig, and I quit my job, and I had a dinner party the next night, and afterward a couple friends of mine, one of whom is never shy about giving me career advice.
Sure.
And you can hear him on his podcast, Canada Land. So Jesse Brown, media critic, friend critic, career critic, said something along the lines of, you should find a way to host dinner parties for a living, because that's really where your strength lies.
Yes. Did you suspect you were better than average at throwing dinner parties?
I thought I was, which is funny because now I look back and I think what a boob I was.
You realized there were levels and levels to rise.
Well, I mean, so I've been writing this column for 5 years now, and I hosted this week my 241th dinner party column. And, you know, early on, I remember I had one where I had a bunch of people over and a friend who was there for the dinner. She said afterwards, "Here's a note. You know, people like napkins."
Oh, sure.
It was like a thing that hadn't occurred to me. I
How
don't know.
long have you been forgetting napkins?
I can't say. Let's not actually.
Past is past.
Yeah, but it was astonishing because. So the reason for that is, yes, I thought I was good at hosting and I was good at certain things, but I had come from a cooking background and I had far too much of my sense of self and sense of hosting was all about the food, right? And I wanted to impress people with food, which is a mistake I made again and again until I sort of grew out of that. And in fact, when I transitioned from cooking to writing, I had an interview to become the restaurant critic, or to fill in for the restaurant critic for the Toronno Star, who's going on maternity leave. And the editor at the time, Leslie Taylor, I remember in the interview, during which I just sweated and sat there in fear of her for about an hour and a half. It was really terrifying because I was like, I'm a child. How come a grown-up is talking to me about a grown-up job? But I remember she asked me, and now I realized it was just an idle question because she'd already decided she wanted to hire me.
This was the post-interview.
No, this was during the interview. Months later, I had dinner with her, and she said, "Did you notice I put my notes away after 5 minutes?" I said, "No." She said, "Yeah, I knew I wanted you. I just kept you talking." I had no idea. I was completely on the edge the whole time. But she asked me, she said, "So in a review, what percentage, and this is not a science, but what percentage would you allocate to the food versus service or ambiance?" And I said something like 75% food. No, 80. And I wouldn't say that now at all.
You thought you didn't seem serious at 75, but at 80.
Yeah, I'm not committed enough. And that was because that was my background, right? I mean, I had done a bit of serving in a restaurant, but not enough to really respect it as an art form. Maybe art form's a bit strong, but, you know, to really respect, absolutely, the artistry, the science and the thought and the grace that goes into good service. To say nothing of design, you know, the brilliance of restaurant design. But I mean, just from service versus cooking, that was both sort of I think that was a crutch as a critic, because I did get that job, and that was a bit of a crutch as I started hosting. And at that dinner years ago, and for many dinners, it was definitely, that was my weak spot, because I was all about like, oh, I'm gonna do all these things and you're gonna be impressed. And when you do that, you end up spending all your time over at the stove instead of sitting down and spending time with people who ostensibly you like, right? And so getting over that was when I actually became a good host.
Taking away the focus on the food you'd spent your previous career developing, then you had to sort of strip that away?
Well, at the same time, I was still learning as a cook, right? I mean, I had learned a lot of basics and I had learned a lot of tricks, but those cover up a broad ignorance or a lack of actual confidence in being able to be creative, or I think more importantly, to think of your guests before you think of yourself. Before thinking of, I learned this recipe in a restaurant, or I came up with an idea, or I saw it in a book and I'm going to do it and it tastes great and it looks great. Before that, thinking of, hold up. First of all, what allergies do you have? What food restrictions do you have? What do you like to eat? What makes people happy? How do people like to eat? Do people like to have a little plate with a perfectly seared, tataki tuna or something? Oh, it's so precisely cooked with little micro seedling greens on top of it and the jus that you reduce down to a syrup state. Or do people like to have a big lasagna that they can dig into with a giant spoon and slap down on their plate? And
it seems like those aren't the same person, ultimately.
It's sometimes the same person on different days, or even at different parts in the meal. Right. And one of the things I learned to do over time is to alternate between those, the plated dish and the shared dish. And it's it's so concrete and visible how people relax when they eat family style, how they're forced into being a bit more close. Right. I mean, you just have to, right? Because when you've got your own little fiefdom, your own little plate of food, you can sit there with it, and you just have to physically get closer to people. I know that sounds a little simplistic, but the first thing is you have to reach for it. And in the context here is also 90% of the dinners I'm hosting, I've got people coming over, they're strangers, right? The first thing is you have to reach for it, but then we have manners, so we don't just reach for food, we serve other people, right? And the immediate thing that happens is a person who doesn't know another person is now, scooping that whatever it is for the other person, and it's such a tiny little bit of civility, but it totally brings people closer together, and it changes their dynamic.
So when did you begin doing majority stranger dinner parties, I guess? Was this an interest of yours from the beginning? Like, what would be cool if I could bring a lot of people I don't know over? Or what was the process? Did it start out as this friends only thing, or what happened?
It grew out of an idea that my boss had that I always want to credit her, but I hijacked the idea from the beginning to turn it into hosting dinner parties. Her idea came from this interview I did with Ruth Reichl, and at the time, Ruth Reichl was the editor of Gourmet. When I decided I wanted to be a writer, the dinner at which Jesse Brown suggested I should host dinner parties, at that same dinner, instead of a bottle of wine, his then girlfriend Lily Cho brought me a copy of Ruth Reichl's book, Tender at the Bone, and I read that book. I tore through it, and it hugely inspired me, and then I read all her books, including the one that influenced every restaurant critic, Garlic and Sapphires, which is what people remember about it is that it's about her wearing disguises and becoming her mother, which it's great storytelling, they're wonderful themes, but for me it was the blueprint for being a critic. It was the blueprint for the values and the methodology of it. And then there's an in-between book about her earlier days as a critic in San Francisco and LA. So she was going to be in Toronto. She was on a book tour, and I had arranged an interview with her. I was hugely excited. She was my idol, absolutely. And I couldn't figure. I was polling friends. Where should I take her for lunch? Right, and it was a question of should I take her somewhere super fancy to impress her? Or should I take her to my cool Chinese restaurant to show her that I'm hip? Right. And Lily said you should make lunch for her. And I thought that sounded crazy because, obviously I'm going to flop. It's going to be a huge embarrassment. How can I cook for her? And she said, you're a restaurant critic. Would you rather someone take you somewhere fancier? They made you like I said, I'd love a salad. I'd love a salad or a sandwich at home. That sounds lovely. It's a great idea. Let's do it. I made her a sandwich, GLT, so guanciale, lettuce, and tomato. And she came over and she was just thoroughly gracious and lovely. And I only had her for an hour, but she was such a perfect interview subject. And she looked at my rack of pots, and she nailed me on having polished all my copper pots the night before. You can see them now, right? They're like copper pots normally look, not like last night I was so nervous about you coming that I polished all my copper pots. He pointed that out, but when I started assembling the sandwich, she came over and she asked me about it and asked me where the bread comes from, where the tomatoes come from, if the tomatoes were picked by people paid a slave's wage or not. And it was, anyway, so it was great. But before she came over, I was sweating bullets again. The only two times that year I sweated like that, when Leslie interviewed me and when I interviewed Ruth Reichl. And so months later, my boss called me into her office, and I asked her, of course, am I in trouble? What did I do? And she said, you did this blog post about the interview you wrote with Ruth Reichl. And the interview was good, but the blog post was better because the blog post was about how you felt in interviewing her and how nervous you were and why you made that sandwich and your thinking behind that. Do you think you could do that every week?
I see. She wanted the blog post.
Yeah, which is a nice lesson in, sometimes, I write for a newspaper and I'm often tailoring what I do towards that audience, and we all do that in our lives and careers, and sometimes going around that and being a little more honest and writing what's true to you can connect with people in an unexpected way. So I felt I felt good about it. I told her, I can't interview my idol every week, right? I only have so many people.
Yeah, you'll run out.
Yeah, I can't get Ghostface, and it's unlikely that Batman's going to come to my house.
Stays home.
But I can interview people over the table, and in the back of my mind is, I'm gonna have a dinner party every week. I'm gonna host people. I'm gonna host people in my home,
Right.
and
That's
it's gonna
the
be a
real
dinner
goal.
party. Yeah, and it was more like over the course of a year reviewing restaurants, which was my dream job, and it was an amazing year of my life. But it also left me a little cold with that social experience, and missing missing cooking for myself, and missing spending time with friends in a more relaxed environment. And over the course of the first few months, Kim was my boss. She really gave me a lot of rope to hang myself in terms of doing things one way or another. And I messed around enough with the format. And she I think only one time came and said, "Hey, Corey, I don't think this works what you're doing here."
What did you do that time?
I had the head of the Toronto District School Board over, and as is usually the case, anytime I have someone over who's particularly, I don't know, smart or important, or however you want to put it, I need other people who are at the table who are smarter than me, which is pretty much everyone I know.
Well, you always want to be in life, I find. You want people smarter than you around.
Absolutely.
If you're the smartest person in the room, you're in the wrong room.
Absolutely. Yeah. I definitely, much as I love the fantasy of like having an entourage of people who,
Of idiots.
Yeah, of idiots who are like, "Good one, boss." I'd love people to call me boss. Absolutely. I like to surround myself with people who make me feel stupid, because that makes me smarter. And in the context of these dinners, I need people who will, ask smarter questions than I will. If I have a guy who's the conductor for a symphony, my classical music friends are going to engage them. And it's not about questions in terms of like grilling them. It's more about having a conversation where they speak their language. Yeah. So I had over the head of the TDSB, the Toronto District School Board, Chris Spence, who, footnote, later was discredited as a fraud.
Oh, the fraudulent. How was he fraudulent?
He had plagiarized a bunch of speeches and essays, and then it went back, and I think may have plagiarized part of his dissertation.
So would you think back and say, maybe this guy seemed like a fraudulent guy at the time? You know what I mean? Like you look for cracks in the facade?
I was not looking for that. I don't think I've ever invited anyone over and go like, "I'm going to check if you turn out to be a serial plagiarist."
I mean, in retrospect, like you always think back, whenever someone you kind of know gets in some scandal, you're like, could I have seen this coming? Were there any signs?
To me, not at all.
He's a good fraud.
He seemed like he seemed like a passionate, committed person who really believed about the changes that he wanted to effect in the Toronto School Board. His methods may have been undone by...
Also good at writing speeches, but his heart maybe was in the right place.
Well, ultimately the one that got him was, I think he wrote an op-ed about talking to his son about the shootings at Sandy Hook, and about hugging his son, that was copied and pasted from someone else's. So that's the sort of, it's not just an intellectual fraud, but an emotional one where you go, okay, now you really made me feel like a jerk for having feelings for you.
Did he not realize there was the internet?
I don't know. I don't know. He's trying to reshape his image. At the point being, I had all these people over, and I had over this I had a friend who's a school teacher, and a teenager who's on the student, he's like school president, whatever, it's some super smart kid, and a colleague who's an older guy who was writing a long series about schools. And either way, it was more of you got from the panel much more of a sort of panel-y debate, and during in the column it felt more like, oh, here's a bunch, and I'm representing all these people, which then when you're writing for the space of a column is the challenge, is how do I introduce all these peoples and not already have used up my word count, and then represent their viewpoint, and then shoehorn in this meal that we're having and why. But I always feel good if somebody likes something I do and someone else doesn't for the same reasons. That means I'm at least being true to myself. And at the time there was a changeover and Kim left. Kim was a great boss and Janet became my boss. And I remember Kim told me, she said, this column, the TDSB column, the Chris Spence column, I feel like you're kind of, you're losing your focus a little bit. There's too many voices. And when I met with Janet to talk about the column, she said, one column I really liked was the Chris Spence TDSB column. Sure. I liked it, and I thought, if two people, and not just random two people are both my boss, sure, who are in charge of me. And
can't please every boss.
You can't please everyone, let alone every boss. But I mean, if they could see that from two different opinions, then that's okay. That means it doesn't have to be exactly the same thing or mean the same thing to everybody all the time.
Tell me a little bit about not just the art of figuring out interesting food combinations for these, but interesting people combinations. I mean, you know who you want to be sort of the star of it for the week. But then what comes to mind when you think, who am I going to combine with these people? As you say, you want as smart people as you can get, but do you think of what types of people do you think really making proverbial intellectual sparks, when they strike?
Right. Well, sparks are great. I mean, I like, if it happens, a little debate, right? Not a mean-spirited debate, not an angry thing where people march out. Have you ever had that happen at dinner?
I've not seen that happen, but I take it.
Ever been at dinner where someone gets in a real thing and they're angry?
Oh, jeez. I'm trying to think back. There's people, I feel like there are people who just are looking for those. Sure. And they want to storm out. And they're a tinderbox and someone's going to set them off.
Do you ever host dinner?
I haven't done it in a long time, no. You're much more experienced than I am.
There's a little bit of a formula, or rather there's certain types of people you kind of always want to have at the table. And they may be that crew of your best friends, right? That's why they're called A Squad. Or at least that's how they're organized in my book of addresses. So essentially, I definitely, in the context of my column, I want that guest to be comfortable, right? Because the primary focus is, this is an interview disguised as a dinner party, or a dinner party disguised as an interview, and I want them to feel both at the same time, right? Like, hey, this is a nice thing, I'm going to have dinner, it's going to be fun, and there's nice and cool people there, but also, oh, hey, it's also like an interview and it's on the record, even though I'll occasionally turn the machine off. So first I want them, if they want to bring someone, right? You should bring your husband or your wife or whoever it is, your colleague sometimes, and that usually kind of chills someone out a bit, makes them feel a bit more comfortable. I think any dinner party needs to have at least one extroverted person who just, no matter where you are in the world, will keep the conversation going. You could be in the desert, you could be in Tokyo, or you could be at the dinner table, and they'll always have something to say or something to ask, without being the attention demanding, glory hog, right?
I realize, I'm thinking back across my life and realize I've been called into various situations in that capacity. That's good. Do you have a name for that? What do you call?
I call that person the talker.
Okay. But you want them not to just yammer. You want them to get other people talking.
Well, there's a distinction, and I think those people in your life, and hopefully you don't have a certain type in your life, but there's a clear distinction between the type of person who's good at opening up other people and who's good at contributing, but doesn't demand that everyone pay attention to them all the time. Because I can't stand those people.
What's the tell? When there's an unknown coming, and they could be anything. Mm-hmm. What's the tell where you're like, this is an attention demanding problem? Is there some sign or behavior your spidey sensing out for?
Well, there's a lot of wild cards for me in terms of, I'm usually inviting someone and I have not met them before. But maybe I've seen them on TV, maybe I've read interviews with them, maybe I've bumped into them, maybe I did like a little pre-screener on the phone. But, it's not uncommon in our culture. Important people often are blowhards. Often
they got to be important.
Yeah.
We believe them.
Or there was just no time for anyone else to interject, and so they just kept getting promoted, right? They're like, well, we can't get a word in edgewise, so why don't we just promote you to vice president?
At least you'll be out of our way.
Yeah, someone else can listen to you yammer. I had one of those a couple weeks ago, but usually it's that one person, and then I'm sort of casting it around. But also, I'm often inviting other people I don't know. I have this luxury. There's so many people at the Star where I can go, oh, this is about transit or country music. Who do I know who's kind of more of an expert in that? And then also get to meet a colleague who I haven't met before, which is neat. Mm-hmm. By and large, most journalists are not blowhards, right? Because it's their job to listen. And most of them are good at engaging other people. But also, I've discovered a lot of them are introverts and don't really want to talk or give their own opinions.
Right. Do you make people deposit their smartphones in a basket or something before they come in? That seems like it could be smart.
I don't. I would love that.
Like a lead shield in your condo
as a
here.
Control freak, I'd love to do that. I'd say it's pretty rare that people bring their phones out at the table at my place. That may be because they know I'm writing a column and might write about that.
This guy on his phone out the whole time.
Which at the very least says they know it's rude to begin with, right?
Yes.
I mean, the reality is we've all adapted our behavior. I go to the bathroom to mess with my phone. I mean, I go there to floss too. Sure. But I go to the bathroom and I check and return emails, tweets. It keeps
buzzing in your pocket. You're like, what's going on? Is someone dead?
Yeah. I mean, the thing is I also have a photographer coming. And I always schedule the photographer like an hour into dinner so people have had a drink, they're a bit more relaxed. So I do need to have the phone on hand because there's always, oh, Corey, I'm stuck on the highway or whatever, I'm going to be late. Right. The door to your building is broken or something like that. So I'm really glad, once the photographer's here, I can put my phone away because I feel like me just having my phone in my pocket or potentially on the table is a signal to other people that they can bring their phones out.
This isn't okay what I'm doing here.
It's rare that it happens. I mean, but it's my rule in terms of, okay, let's say this is not, you're going over to someone's house who writes this dinner party column, but just as a friend dinner, you should not have your phone out. Unless you're a doctor on call, your phone stays in your pocket. Check when you go to the bathroom, but it's rude. You want to engage.
Yeah, those weird old beepers usually, so.
Some doctors do have beepers.
Yeah, the signal's different. It always gets to them somehow.
Yeah, well, in Toronto, you can't get a phone signal in the subway. So I've met people who have beepers because of that. And I had the mayor over, not this mayor, the last mayor, he came over for dinner one night. It was just after, he was getting these like BlackBerry messages about how Toronto was going to donate to the Haiti relief. And I was like, dude, go ahead and check your phone. You're more important than I am.
Yeah, help that country over there. This is the dinner party will survive. Haiti needs an assistance.
But at the same time, despite being the boss of a town of 3 million people, he did that. He checked his phone. He said, okay, I'll put it away now.
So, there's all kinds of Torontonians that come here, mayor on down. But is it always all Torontonians, or do you want to try to pull a non-Toronto element in as well sometimes?
You mean to the dinners?
Exactly, yeah.
Right. Well, I mean, first of all, love hearing people who are not from here pronounce the name of our town, because if anything, it sounds better.
Really?
Yeah.
For listeners, let's make sure this is absolutely clear. What is the way insiders say the name of this city?
Well, they don't pronounce the second T, so it's Toronto.
Toronto. Yeah. Okay. Not Toronto.
Not Toronto. And yet, when I hear Toronto, I think, oh, I better sit up straight. Yeah, that sounds like a much classier town. Like in the bizarro world, there's a super classy version of Toronto called Toronto. And I think, ooh, that sounds delightful.
Better than the Toronto I live in.
It is populated with Torontonians.
Yes. But I would guess mostly Torontonians at your dinner parties. But how often do you get people who are not?
Well, someone comes from outside, and it's always great. I mean, every once in a while, I hear about some comedian who's in Toronto, and I pitch to them, and I can't get them. They're only here for a night, and they go, what? Paul F. Tompkins is like, why would I want to do some local? Sorry, I'm not calling out Paul F. Tompkins. He's my dream guest. Sure. But I think I'll pitch him as many times as he comes to Toronto, right. But I can't think of a conceivable reason unless it's advanced before a gig and it drums up sales tickets, which is already going to be sold out anyways. Why does it want to come over? It's, it's a local paper, right? But I have had...
Still, I mean, if I were Paul F. Tompkins, showing up at things you wouldn't expect him to be at seems almost in his wheelhouse, you know?
He should be. He should know that Bill Murray can't live forever.
Yes.
And someone has to become our most cherished comedic figure who also just shows up unexpectedly on golf courses and weddings and bar mitzvahs and at my house for dinner. But I remember a panel of there was like a design conference that was, I think, specifically talking about design in buildings dealing with health. And I had a bunch of people over from here, and it was great. And it was really interesting. There were a lot from London, and I think one from Central America. And it was really interesting just listening to outsiders look with both curiosity, sadness, and amusement at our city and ask the very questions that we ask, but who could afford to sort of laugh at the answers and go, oh dear, and then say, well, actually, in a city you might look down on, they have a far better transit system, or they're way better along with this.
Right. It's always valuable to get the outsider's perspective on one's own city. I mean, what sort of... I'll put it this way, I'll make it even more general. I mean, these discussions that happen about Toronto at the dinner parties, when have they taken directions that you never talked about the city in ways you'd never thought about? And have the conversations at your dinner parties sort of shed new light on Toronto to you, new ways to think about this city? I mean, how long have you been here? How acclimated to Toronto? How Torontonian is your mind space at this point?
Well, very much so, but I mean, hosting dinner is what got me interested in Toronto.
Oh, I see. So it's that way around. I get you.
Absolutely. I was extremely myopic. When you work in a kitchen, it's often a windowless room, and you work probably with 10 or 20 men and women who share the view that the world outside that room isn't important.
Yeah, that's not the game.
Yeah.
It's right in here.
Yeah, absolutely. They're like, tonight's service is the most important thing happening in everyone's life.
Because if you don't believe that, it ain't going to happen, in a way.
Absolutely, because you do have to be that committed, and there is a certain type of math that goes on with cooking that you really have to be present for. And then I started writing, and I got lucky, and I managed to review restaurants, and that was my whole world. And I didn't really care about the world outside of that, except maybe comic books and movies. And then I started inviting the city into my home for dinner. And so I just moved here a couple months ago, but my previous place is a few blocks over, and it's not a super big place. But I started caring, man. You know what I mean? Like, I had the catalyst was this. I had over my city councillor, and it was very early on, and I'm even embarrassed of this column now. But one of the things we talked about was in this neighborhood, Kensington, there were no garbage cans on the street. And I said, what's the deal with that, man?
Right. That's where you can throw things away when you're walking.
Yeah. This is a thing they have in every city in the world. Right. And the answer after dinner, during dinner, I couldn't understand what he was saying. Oh. It was too bureaucracy speak.
So it took the recording light going off? Is this what?
No. I mean, later I had to do more. Later I said, I don't understand his answer. Oh. And I understand now why I didn't understand it, because it was evasive, which I didn't know how to contest at the time. And another of the guests turned out to be a lawyer for the company that's the advertising firm that got the contract to install Toronto street furniture, which includes garbage cans, bus shelters, and it turns out that basically anything they couldn't immediately put sell advertising space on became less of a priority. And in this neighborhood, you have to Kensington exists outside of reality a little bit in terms of, Toronto's a city of rules, and a bylaw officer will come and write you a ticket if your sign is taking up too much space on the sidewalk or whatever. But Kensington, it's a free-for-all.
Anything goes.
Anything goes, but the problem is when they have to design a garbage can, they can't figure out stuff like, Well, the rules state that there has to be enough space for a wheelchair to get past, and yet there isn't because this sidewalk is half taken up with boxes of dates and oranges and tank tops. So we have to figure out at any rate, there were all those considerations. And it took me days of calling people at City Hall and calling people at Astro Media to figure out all that stuff. And I thought, and this was just an arbitrary question I asked at dinner. I was just a little curious. And I thought, how frustrating must it be for any citizen to have to go through this process when it really matters to them, when it's about not being able to park on their own street, not, there being no space in childcare for them, or that their city councillor, their mayor promised them that there would be a bus or a streetcar or a subway that was going to be built in X number of years, and it isn't. And they can't get where they need to go, which is the state of Toronto. And I wouldn't say it radicalized me, but it all of a sudden it switched something in my brain where
Galvanized you.
Sure, that's a great word. I like that. Now I can't stop thinking of Megatron. Sorry. Megatron, and of course, Transformers the movies became Galvatron. He switched voice from Frank Welker to Leonard Nimoy, but then back to Welker for the TV series.
So you switched voices when you realized that you could be engaged in the city.
To my Leonard Nimoy voice. I just started caring about the city, and I started seeing it, and then that was very early on the column, and then over the course of, it's been 5 years now, just had so many more people of so many different backgrounds come in and bring with them the things that matter to them, in all the pockets of the city.
Now, this neighborhood, Kensington, we're over its streets right here in your home, and walking here, I'm staying up on Harvard, so I walked sort of down alongside the university and sort of on College and Augusta, and walking through this neighborhood, I can describe it only as a food paradise. Is that true?
Yeah, well, it's my paradise, and I live here because of the food.
Why is the food so good in this neighborhood?
Well, 100 years ago, the ward is what the area around City Hall was called. And the ward was basically where all the immigrants were living, right? And it was a slum. And eventually the city bought the land and started transforming it. My great-grandfather Herschel around that time had a blacksmith shop, which is now the bus depot where you go to catch a bus. Not a city bus, but like a Greyhound.
Sure.
Him and all the Jews started to move 3 or 4 blocks west, and they brought with them their carts to sell food on the street. So 100 years ago, these 2 or 3 story houses, row houses, they're outside the window, they all had a little stall on the street. And over the course of that generation, they came to own the buildings or rent the buildings, and they became more permanent structures. And if you go down to the park at the end of the street, you can see a synagogue. There used to be a dozen synagogues in the neighborhood, but there's a synagogue with that Herschel built, and his name is up on the top of it, and it's still staying there. It's a heritage structure, which, if I had any say, I'd sell it. Because there's nobody in the congregation anymore. And not that I turn into a condo or anything, but I'm just saying it's not of much use anymore.
It could make a pretty penny.
It could make a pretty penny, or it could house a lovely community center or something like that.
Could be something else.
So over the course of that generation, they started to have more money, and it became the food depot before the actual food terminal was opened. So the 2 things that happened in the 50s are, one, you've got more Jews coming here after the war. The Jews here having money, and like any immigrant population, started to move out to the suburbs. So Jews started moving north. They also opened the big food terminal, which is where all the food comes in. And then a lot of wholesalers will go down there to buy from. But the market became, and so here's an example of what it was. I had over the heads of 2 taxi companies in the city, and they mapped out for me decade by decade the immigration population.
Oh, really?
And they said, yeah. So
they would know. Yeah.
They would know, right? Because one of the things that people do when they come to this country is they drive cabs. So they said, sure, after the Jews, it was Greeks, and then it was Jamaicans, and then it was East Indians, Iranians in the late 70s, Ethiopians in the
all bringing their foods.
Yeah, and all bringing their food. Sri Lankans in the late 80s, early 90s. I mean, every restaurant I worked in has a Sri Lankan dishwasher.
Really?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, but of course, they couldn't settle any more here anymore because the real estate value has gone up, right? But over the course of that, the neighborhood became Jewish, Portuguese, Jamaican, and of course Kensington is also bordered by Chinatown. So by the 60s, it's a mishmash of all those things. It's thriving, and then it starts to decline in terms of it becomes less about the food. Punks kind of move in the late 70s, early 80s. And they're still around. Early 80s, people start objecting to live chickens being sold and slaughtered in the streets. And, you know, people like to complain about every little bit of gentrification, but of course it's been going on since day one.
Right.
And so at around that time, the early 80s, my mother lived in an apartment over there. Like, my mother was like in and out of a mental institution on welfare, lived in an apartment filled with cockroaches, you know, just a few doors from here. And they continued to thin out the number of butchers, bakers, grocers to the point where now there are 4 or 5 produce shops, 2 butcher shops. One just closed. One just renovated. One recognized that Sannigan's, which moved in, which is locally sourced, free range, all that type of thing.
New wave butcher shop.
However you want to put it, the new style of butcher shop. I've written enough words about it. Sorry, I feel like, do I have to describe what a modern butcher shop is again? It's yada yada yada. You know what I'm talking about? The good butcher shop. But it has displaced a certain type of clientele, you know. And I remember when Sannigan's first started, a lot of Jamaicans were walking in and going, "Oxtail? Do you have oxtail? Oh yeah, great. How much? $5.69 a pound. That's too much."
Forget.
Yeah, the old guy was $3.59 a pound. Yes. So there are still. So I think there's now 2 old school Portuguese fishmonger, and then there's Hooked, which is only sustainable fish. Yes. You know, and all these new food businesses, they're all run by chefs and ex-chefs. And then St. Andrew's, the old poultry place, they just renovated. They want to be part of this new generation. But we're seeing over the past few years a group really started by Sannigan's, the butcher shop, that has not just started to gentrify, but really widening a gap isn't the right way to put it. I think it's more of inviting a middle-class clientele down to the market. And then that has cross-pollinated. I've seen people who come down to the market because it's close enough, they'll go, oh, the good meat is here, they'll go for this. And then Sannigan moved locations, leased his, or gave his old lease up to the fish people, so now there was a good fish shop, then started selling bread from this really good bakery, enough that his audience started buying bread from him. They get hooked on the bread. Then the bakery moves in next door. And so we've seen like a lot of change in the last few years, but I think it's good change. And of course, it's also the other cross street here is 90% secondhand clothing.
Oh, really?
So there's a whole culture of that, right? And students who shop there, there's always like the first week in September, all these like teenage girls or, you know, their moms they've dragged their moms down here because like, we want something cool, mom.
Yes.
And you know, there's like within these 3 blocks, there's like 6 or 8 coffee shops and 3 tattoo parlors, and
it's got everything.
It's got everything, and there are a lot of those older business too. There is the Portuguese cafe and you know, the place where the Italians hang out, and it's so much within 3 blocks.
Now, if people from outside Toronto know Toronto, they know it for one thing, not aside from Rob Ford, multiculturalism. Does the multiculturalism of Toronto does that directly translate to it being a place where you can find sort of the best world microcosm in eating terms? Like, is Toronto, in your experience, the city with the sort of strongest variety of world cuisines?
Well, I'm not going to compare Toronto to anyone else. And have you already talked to Jamie Wu?
Yes. That was day one.
Oh, that was day one. Well, yeah, I right off the bat, I feel like, well, don't ask the white guy about multiculturalism, you know? But the reality is Toronto is still very, very segregated. It's very segregated by race and economic class. And yeah, we've got all these great cuisines because all these people have come to Toronto because it is a good place to live. It is a good place to raise your family. But you can't afford to live downtown. That's nuts. You know, I can afford to live downtown because my great-grandfather got here before because they were killing Jews in the Ukraine, and he was like, I'm going to get the fuck out of here.
Yeah.
He came here, was like, this is pretty good, and he hustled from blacksmith to furniture salesman and saved a few shekels, and now I get to live downtown. That's great. And other people had their horrible pogroms and civil war later on. And so to go eat Sri Lankan, you got to go out to Scarborough. I know a fantastic Sri Lankan place in Scarborough. We went out last week to this Nigerian place in Etobicoke, which was phenomenal, but I only went out there. For the most part, people don't. Toronto is really underserved by transit, and in the last municipal election, we had a mayor who's most famous for being a drug addict, but in Toronto, he would also be known as the guy who says, there was a whole transit plan that was about to commence that he axed on day one, and he promised people subways that he was going to get private investors to build, which turned out to be obviously a sham. And in the end, people are still sitting out there unable to get anywhere. Some friends met us at this Nigerian restaurant in Etobicoke, and it took them 2 hours on the bus to get out there, which is nuts, right? And I mean, I understand that LA is not super well served by public transit.
It's getting better every day.
At the very least, I was there in February, and it was such a dream to drive there. Bear in mind, I didn't have a job, so I don't have to drive a rush hour.
Right.
Okay? I know it's terrible in rush hour, but
I don't drive there at all in Los Angeles, no.
I'm sorry, this is a trite question that you're asked all the time, but how do you get by in LA without a car?
Trains, bike, which same thing you use here, I think. I mean, it's not.
I don't need to go anywhere here is the point.
Right.
Like I live here like a proboscis monkey lives by the river because the food source is here, right?
Right, I know what you mean. Although there is this effect I've found a lot of parallels in Los Angeles and Toronto. And in Los Angeles as well, people complain about the transit. And it seems like in Toronto, it's because the transit got built and then frozen in a certain era, and the city got too big for it. Yeah. In Los Angeles, it's because it was so delayed being built in the first place. Your subways got here in the 40s and 50s. Ours got there in the 90s. So there's a different form of thing holding the transit back in each city. But it ends up with.
It has the same effect, doesn't it?
Yeah, it ends up with the same complaint. And
to keep people in their neighborhoods.
It does that as well. And you mentioned the suburbs, going out for good food in the suburbs. I think the same thing happens in Los Angeles. You can find the best Chinese food outside China, from what I hear, but it's going to be a 45-minute drive east.
But in LA, the difference is I couldn't get anyone to go with me.
You couldn't get anyone to go with you in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
They wouldn't go, really?
Well, the handful of people I know, they're like, Corey, that's a 45-minute drive.
I know some people in Los Angeles who are insane and will drive 45 minutes to one place, 45 minutes to the next place. The first place was for drinks, then 45 to the dinner, then 45 to wherever they're going next.
That's the real problem. You can't have more than a couple drinks at dinner.
Yeah, that's true.
That is maddening, you go out and you say, well, this is great. I'm having a nice time. I'd love to have another drink. I can't. I have to. I just got my driver's license last year, so I'm particularly phobic of having, and I'll have a drink and go, this is okay. And the second drink, I'm not having a third drink. But yeah, and I was staying with friends who have little kids, so that's a consideration as well. But
it's another reason I don't have a car is because you can't do whatever you want if you're responsible for this giant metal thing that could kill people. I don't know.
Yes, I have one of my friends I think she's in Silver Lake, and she was riding a bike for like 2 years. She just gave in and bought a car. But in Toronto, you can't, in addition to the fact that we're underserved by transit, we have roads built for, we have 2-lane roads. Those are our main east-west roads, with a lane of parking and a lane for streetcars. And it's maddening. In LA, I realize it's frustrating with people who have to drive at rush hour. But for me, I was going, this is sweet. There's 5 lanes. People are letting me in when I signal. It was heaven.
There are moments, especially in the middle of the night, when it's pretty nice to drive in Los Angeles.
I was mostly driving around during the day. I just felt like I was staying with friends. They had kids. I said, I'm going to go off myself. I'm going to go over to East LA to get a taco. I'm going to drive 40 minutes. And it was great. And I loved it. I didn't hit any traffic. People let me in. It was a very pleasurable experience versus here. In addition to the fact that the lanes are narrow, we we don't coordinate our construction. I had over, so two of the people running for mayor right now, I had them over the last 2 weeks. And the one question I asked for both of them is, why are we not coordinating construction in terms of they'll dig up the same road 3 years in a row for water, electricity, and road surface. And then there'll also be like condo development at one end of the street and one at the other. And you can't drive 2 blocks without hitting traffic. It's an incredibly frustrating thing that, you know, that makes you go, okay, well, let's just take the TTC. And then you get on the streetcar and you're sitting there going, no. So I ride a bike everywhere. Yeah. But so the reason I went out to this Nigerian restaurant was by design. A friend had dragged me to some kooky art show happening thing where essentially, so it was curated by this guy who got a bunch of teenagers to do this presentation about the social economic distinctions between people in Toronto. And in the end, there was this whole sort of, they led us into a room filled with smoke and a diorama of Toronto. And these teens led us into laid us down on cots and whispered stories to us about their experiences living where they lived. And then at the end, we had to make this pledge to go visit somewhere. Right. In either North York, Scarborough, or Etobicoke, and we had choices of there were a whole bunch of things on a big board, you know, like parks and everything. Right. And of course, give me the restaurant, right? So I picked a Hakka restaurant, which is a sort of a Chinese Indian cuisine, and my friend David picked a Nigerian restaurant. And I mean, I was excited. I was like, you don't have to twist my arm. I'm glad to have this excuse, but I totally wouldn't have made it to either restaurant without them. Right. And then we went out to them, and it was so wonderful. And the Hakka restaurant was delicious, but the Nigerian restaurant was so cool because it was a total expatriate place. Oh, really? It was, you know, the Hakka place was like, okay, this is a neighborhood restaurant where people eat. And the Nigerian place, the Suya spot, it was really a club, actually, where they served food, it turned out. And all the food was just bowls of roasted scraps of meat. Nice. At which point one of the people we were with said, I should have told you this before, I'm a vegetarian. Oh, God. She was a good sport of eating her plate of plantain. But, you know, everybody's
pretty good.
Plantain's great. And they cooked it beautifully. And all the meats were really good. It was just funny because it was, so it was early Saturday, and we were told like, oh, it's more of a dance club at nighttime, and everybody who came in was definitely not speaking English, and they were all really nice. And at a certain point, you know, I know that certain places aren't just sort of like, oh, you can get this kind of food, but also like, I can go somewhere and people can speak the language that they spoke back home, and I can not be so homesick. Exactly.
You're almost on the soil of that country when you go into these restaurants.
Yeah, I mean, the only decoration was a map of Nigeria on the wall. Right. But at a certain point, the owner came out and she gave us the sort of, hey, how'd you find out about us? Which is really like, what are you white folks doing here? Sure. And we told her, no, it was more like, I would love to know how you ended up here so I could get more. You know, I mean, it's the owner of a restaurant. You want more people to come here.
Nobody doesn't want to blow up.
Yes, and go home and tell your friends nice things about us. But so as she said, well, let me show you the rest of the place. And and this room was like a cafeteria room, like just no decoration. Other than I was looking up at the chandeliers and I was like, are those video cameras? I was pretty sure there were video cameras on the wall. And she took us into the back. She goes, this is a VIP room. And there was a dark room with leather sofas. Oh my God. And then led us downstairs, and there was a whole other floor. There was a party room, but it was like a dance club. Wow. With mirrored walls and a DJ booth, all sitting dormant. She said, oh, we're going to be open till 5 a.m. tonight. Yikes. And we were just sort of like sitting on the precipice of that experience, just there to eat this food, which, as she explained, is like, it's a club. We serve food because it's the law. Right,
I see. It's the place where you were eating was just obligatory for them. The real party was in the back.
I mean, it was delicious, and there was a wonderful seasoning I really liked, and it was just sort of, it was food that you would have like roadside food. It would be street food in a lot of countries, but that we were all just sort of like do you remember the end of what was that movie, From Dusk Till Dawn?
Oh, yeah.
Spoiler alert, if you haven't seen from the 1996 Rodriguez film, From Dusk Till Dawn. But the whole thing is this club that's inhabited by vampires, right. And they spend the night fighting vampires. In the final shot, we pull back from the back of the club. It's on the edge of like a huge canyon, and it's actually the top of an Incan pyramid, and it's like filled with skeletons, and it's basically like there's a much huger story behind this. You guys were just sitting on the top of it, but it was really great because we didn't have a reason to do it outside from that, and then we took the bus home, which I kicked and screamed about, but then enjoyed.
Right. Once you actually have the experience, you can then contextualize it within the city, and you can add it to. You added to your experience of Toronto. Now, in terms of a much closer dining venue, right here in your place, you're doing one of your dinner parties tomorrow, right?
No, tomorrow I'm having a housewarming.
Oh, okay.
Actually.
I see. That's.
Please come.
I think
you're only in town for the week. Maybe
you mentioned it. I think I got invited by one of your guests there. Do you know Aiden? So I think I will be here.
I did say in my 48-hour reminder, please feel free to bring a guest. So.
Right. So I will be in the house of Corey Mintz for something. I was pretty sure it wasn't a dinner party per se, but it's one of these things. I want to get a final question in about. Do you feel like you're reviving some kind of lost art with all of these functions you do in your house?
I hope not. Every once in a while, people say something like, "Oh, that." When I invite them to say that sounds like so nice. We haven't been over to anyone's house for dinner in so long, and they're usually parents who say that, because they've siloed themselves off. But I also meet tons of people who host all the time, and I'm always curious to ask them, how do you do this or how do you do that? And I love it. I love being a guest in other people's homes. I personally feel like just when you're at someone's home for dinner, I truly, even though people are so on edge about, the food has to be great, I don't care about the food at all. Right. If they're good people that you want to spend time with, it doesn't matter. The food just gets you there. And unlike a restaurant, nobody's waiting to get your table back. So I always want, both in hosting, inviting, and being a guest, and I wrote a book about it last year, How to Host a Dinner Party, 1995, House Financial Press. And I feel great when people say, I feel more confident hosting, because I feel like, good, more dinner parties, more people eating at home, spending less money also, and just like more of a world where you have an excuse to also maybe add on that one more person, that if you were, say, let's the six of us meet in this restaurant, that, because you have to commit to the restaurant and all that you're a bit more likely to sort of add on that one other person and mix them in with your friends and discover who goes together and who doesn't.
The permutations and what have you, and the combinations.
Yeah, and sometimes you discover, everybody hates that.
The one guy. There's always that one guy.
I'm not saying Jesse Brown, but just for an example, like a Jesse Brown type,
Throw a name out there, right?
Well, you'll in post you'll put another name in there.
I'll just put a giant beep, just a long beep, and they can imagine who was there. In any case, I look forward to seeing whatever art it is you practice tomorrow here, lost or otherwise. I've been speaking, by the way, here above Kensington in Toronto. Toronto or Toronto, whatever you prefer. It's all the same to me. With Corey Mintz, he is the author of the column Fed in the Toronto Star and the author of the book How to Host a Dinner Party. Corey, thanks so much.
Thank you.
This has been Notebook on Cities and Culture. I've been Colin Marshall. You can keep up with the cultural creators, internationalists, and observers of the urban scene on the show at colinmarshall.org. Thanks. Special thanks to everyone who backed Season 4 on Kickstarter, including Joel Neville Anderson, Daniel Levin Becker, Paige Calvert, Commander Manvark, Jonathan Crow, John Cunningham, David Dawes, James DeVito, Tim Dobbs, Paul Doyle, Jake Elliott, Kevin Emmett, Lawrence English, Jonathan Filbert, Andrew Philippone Jr., Michael Fransky, John French, Themistocles Eucrucius, Will Graham, Umberto Grant, Samuel Hansen, David Hayes, Jeff Hillenbrand, Mark Hines, Andrew Johnstone, Tadeusz Andrzej Kadlubowski, Peter Kavanagh, Ted Kane, Andy Cooney, Evan Landman, Alfred Lee, James Maloney, Sean McDonald, Alberto Bruzos Moro, Jason Miller, Rob Montz, Daniel Murphy, Richard Nash, Aidan Nullman, Patrick O'Flaherty, Danny Olson, Michael O'Regan, Ian Plosker, Christopher Porter, MJ Pritchett, Piers Rippey, Rob Schultz, Todd Shimoda, Cam Smith, Deborah Smith, Adam Sutherland, Maureen Kincaid Speller, Anna Treher, Thomas Unterberger, Matt Warren, Nick Weigelt, John Wolfe, Cynthia Yang, and Wayne Wright.